Here to the education, I don't even know to check. Educational Cultural Center of the Jewish Museum in Prague, on behalf of CET, which is co-sponsoring today's lecture with the Educational Center. Today we are pleased and proud to have with us Professor Pamely Nadell, who is a professor of history and Jewish studies at American University in Washington, D.C. Professor Nadell holds the Patrick Clendenin Chair in Women's and Gender History, and for many years served as the director of the Jewish Studies program at AU. Professor Nadell is one of our foremost authors in the history of American Jewish society and women, and of the conservative movement. She is the author of Women Who Would Be Rabbis, A History of Women's Ordination, 1889 to 1985, which we have here and will be the subject of our talk today. The book was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award. She's also written Conservative Judaism in America, a bibliographical dictionary and source book. Professor Nadell has co-authored and co-edited additional books on similar themes, the most recent of which is New Perspectives in American Jewish History, which came out in 2010. Pamely Nadell advises many Jewish and non-Jewish institutions, including the Library of Congress and the newly opened, congratulations, National Museum of American Jewish History in Philadelphia. And she's additionally won many awards for her teaching and work with students. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm just thrilled to be here. This is a real pleasure to be with you. First of all, to meet the CET students. I want to thank everybody at CET for bringing me here, and also the Jewish Museum. And I'm assuming everybody's fluent in English, or if I go too fast, or if I say a word you don't understand, would you please stop me and let me know? So I'm going to talk today about a book that I wrote quite a while ago, actually. It's called Women Who Would Be Rabbis, and that's the title for the lecture. But I'm also going to use this to tell you a story in much more detail, a lot of which is not based on my own research, about one of these women who actually became a rabbi, but nobody ever knew it. And she has a close connection, not to Prague, but to Terezin. And so I will weave that into my remarks for this evening. It's very appropriate that I start the day after Purim, because the question of whether or not our women could become ministers, which is the word that this woman used, it arose in a story she wrote for the holiday of Purim in a Jewish newspaper in Philadelphia in 1889. So well over 100 years ago, a woman named Mary Cohen, and Jewish women were named Mary in the United States in that period, and Mary Cohen wrote this story on the holiday of Purim for this special issue of the newspaper and said, could not our women become ministers? And when she asked that question, of course, she was a very learned Jew, so she knew that on Purim, you probably know this, everybody gets dressed up, right? Did you all get dressed? I don't know if anybody went to Purim services here. You get dressed up, and it's the one day out of the year that men and women can flip roles, right? Men can get dressed like women can get dressed like men. And so maybe she was making a joke. Maybe she was, she was writing this and it was just a way of saying, okay, so this is a day I can raise the question. But I don't think so, because by 1889, you have to understand how much Judaism had already changed, and also how much was going on in terms of changes in women's roles. So for example, by 1889, we have in Europe, we have liberal Judaism. I assume it had made its way into the Czech Republic as well by then. So we have the invention, which happened in Germany in 1803, of confirmation, a ceremony for girls. In America, by 1889, we already have men and women sitting together in the synagogue. Big change. Now, we don't have that in Europe, because, you know why? You know what's going on in Europe, that men and women don't sit together in the synagogues? Any ideas? Because they don't in the churches. In the churches, in the Protestant churches in Germany, they're still separated. But in America, they're sitting together. So what are they doing? They're emulating the churches, so men and women begin to sit together. But we also have enormous changes around women's roles, at least a huge discussion around women's roles. Beginning in the United States in 1848, we raised the question, can women vote? And not only is that question raised, but also the question about whether or not women's roles can change in other ways. So for example, we already have, by 1889, we have the first female physicians in the United States. We already, by 1889, have women who have tried to become lawyers. We already have women who've actually become ministers by 1889. So when Mary Cohn is raising her question in America, she's aware of all of those changes going on around her. And so it's a way of saying maybe the Jewish community should change as well. In the 1890s, after she raises the question, in the 1890s we began to see more conversation about ordaining women in American life. We see changes in the American Jewish community. There's actually one woman, her name was Ray Frank, and she's called by the press the girl rabbi of the Golden West. She's not really a rabbi, she's not really ordained, but she's going around speaking and preaching in synagogues, and so she's acting like a rabbi. So we have that by the 1890s. We already have, for example, in 1902, a very famous woman named Henrietta Zold. Does anybody know that name, Zold? I don't know if her reputation. She's the most famous woman in American Jewish history, but I don't know if anybody in here would have ever heard of her. She founded an organization called Hadassah. You know Hadassah? Okay, but this is a decade before she founded that, and she wants to study to get knowledge, and so she goes to a rabbinical school in New York called the Jewish Theological Seminary, and when they admit her and say she can study because she wants to edit her father's papers, he was a famous rabbi, she actually has to assure them that she has no interest in becoming a rabbi. So it shows that in 10 years from the time Mary Cohn raised the question to 1902 when Zold goes to study in New York, the question's on the agenda of the American Jewish community. The book that I wrote is really about this conversation about the question. So World War I, things get pretty quiet. And of course, in 1920, in the United States, there's a huge change. And that is that women get the right to vote. The suffrage amendment that had been called for in 1848, finally, 70 years later, passes. And now there's this expectation that changes for women's lives are going to happen all over the United States. And so in the 1920s and the 1930s, there are actually 4 women in the United States who spend time studying to become rabbis. They get admitted to these schools, either Hebrew Union College or the Jewish Institute of Religion in New York. They're American rabbinical schools. And some of them get actually really close to ordination. So the first one was a woman named Martha Neumark, or everybody called her Newmark, but her father would have been Neumark. And you know how she got into rabbinical school? Her father was a professor. You know, it's really easy to turn down a girl who applies and says, I don't have any connections. It's another thing when you're 16 years old and you say, I want to be a rabbi, and your father teaches at the school. So she got so close that they had a debate about whether or not they would ordain her. And in the end, they decided not to. Second one was Irma Levy-Lindheim. And Irma Levy-Lindheim, her husband was on the board of trustees of one of these schools, so also deeply connected. And she studies, and she also got pretty close, and then there was a family crisis. And she ended up, instead of becoming a rabbi, she became national president of the women's organization, Hadassah, the one that Henrietta Zold founded. A lot of interesting connections here. The third was Dora Askowitz, who actually didn't have great connections. And the fourth one was Helen Leventhal. And Helen Leventhal's father and grandfather were very, very well-known rabbis. And she, in 1939, completed the entire curriculum, but instead of becoming a rabbi, instead of being ordained as a rabbi, she was given a special certificate certifying her as a kind of outstanding teacher. And she went on to do a little preaching and then to marry and not act on the rabbinate. Those four women in the 1920s and the 1930s never heard of Regina Jonas, who in Offenbach, Germany, in 1935, was ordained a rabbi. She was a woman who would have been a rabbi, wanted to be a rabbi, and actually received rabbinic ordination. So she's a small segment of my book, but actually a much larger segment of the presentation I want to share with you tonight.
What's the name, please?
Jonas, Regina, R-E-G-I-N-A, Regina Jonas, J-O-N-A-S.
1930.
1935, she was officially ordained. And have any of you ever heard of her? No, I see some, okay, I see several nods. What context?
I have been to Berlin.
Right. Did you see where they put up the plaque? Yeah, a number of years ago, the European Union of Women Rabbis put up a plaque outside of her house, and I assume my historian colleague knows the story. So, Jonas was born in 1902 and grew up in a fairly traditional Jewish family. And she went to gymnasium, a Jewish girls' school first, and then to a gymnasium. And she completed her secondary education in 1924 and got a certificate saying that she was qualified to be a teacher. But she wrote the following: I personally love the rabbinate and want very much to pursue it if and when that will be possible. And so in 1924, she entered, just like these American women were doing, and they don't know about each other, she entered a school in Berlin known as the Hochschule für die Wissenschaft des Judentums. It was a rabbinical school founded in Berlin in 1870. It was the heart of intellectual Jewish life, liberal Jewish life in Berlin. And it trained rabbis, it trained Jewish school teachers, and she began the rabbinical course. So she began taking all of the courses that she needed. By 1930, she had 6 years of rabbinical education, and she wrote a thesis. And the title of her thesis was, Can a Woman Hold Rabbinical Office? Now, it doesn't take a genius to figure out what her argument was. Her argument was yes, but what's so interesting about Jonas is the way in which she used the arguments on why a woman should be able to do that. So the first thing she did was she pointed to these famous Jewish women of the past. So she pointed to Deborah of the Bible. You know your Bible? Okay, so she pointed to Deborah. She pointed to Huldah, who was a biblical prophetess. She pointed to, after the biblical period, a woman who's quoted in the great compendium of Jewish legal literature, the Talmud, a woman named Beruria. She pointed to her. She pointed to the daughters of the great commentator Rashi. She said, all these women were learned, and people listened to their opinions. Because after all, a rabbi is somebody who makes legal rulings within Jewish tradition. So she said, well, we've got these precedents. So I can be a rabbi because I can act like Beruria acted. I can make legal decisions. And what's, of course, very interesting for the historian is the American women who argue they want to be rabbis, they all make the same arguments Jonas made. And they don't know about it. It's like they have to keep reinventing over and over again the wheel. So then she anticipated by half a century a decision made in the United States when the conservative movement in the United States, there are 3 branches of American Judaism, that's the one in the middle. When that movement in 1983 said, yes, we're going to ordain women, it said that it would only ordain women if they took on all of the commandments, all of the Jewish obligations that Jewish men have. And Jonas was already saying that. She said in this thesis that she wrote in 1930, she said that men and women stood together at Mount Sinai. God gave the law there to men and to women, and therefore women can choose, if they want to accept all of the commandments, even the ones that Jewish law says only men have to do, women don't have to do it. So more than half a century before this is taken up in American Judaism. She even finds examples of women who have done this before. She didn't want to break tradition. She other than being a woman, she's not doing anything to break with tradition. She's going to uphold that tradition. So she found an example of a woman in Mainz, Germany, who worked Tefillin, the phylacteries that men wrap around their arms and on their forehead when they pray in the morning. And so she said, Jewish women have done this before. I can do it too. And then where she couldn't get around Jewish law, she said, well, I can be a rabbi and I don't have to break with Jewish law. There's a law that says Jewish women cannot be witnesses. So she said, as a rabbi, I'll get the men to be the witnesses. I won't be a witness. I won't sign the document myself. So also, like others who had preceded her, like Mary Cohen, although of course she didn't know about Mary Cohen, she also was looking at how women's roles in Germany had already changed. So, and in Germany, changes in women's roles come much, much later than they did in the United States. For example, not until 1899 could a woman practice medicine in Germany. That's almost half a century after the first women doctors in the US. Not until 1922 could they be lawyers. Not until 1927 did Protestant women get the title of vicar, kind of subordinate to a minister. And not until 1928 does a Jewish woman preach in a German synagogue. And when she does, she's not German. She actually comes from England. So at the end of her thesis, she wrote, "The world consists of two genders due to God, and that those in the synagogue would benefit from hearing not only the voice of a man, but also the essentially different voice of a woman. Other than prejudice and unfamiliarity, there was nothing, almost nothing, that opposes a woman holding the rabbinical office in Jewish law." So the question was, would they ordain her? And the only person who could ordain at the Hochschule was Professor Edward Banach, who was the scholar of Talmud. And Banach died. Between the time Jonas turned in her thesis and when he would have had to accept it and then ordain her and give her an oral exam, unfortunately he died. And so nobody knows whether or not he would have ordained her. The person below him at the school, another professor named Hanuk Olbach, was opposed to women's ordination. And so instead of becoming ordained, Jonas graduated as a certified teacher of Judaica. I remember I said this school, certified teachers. And that they gave her a special transcript saying she was a thoughtful and skilled preacher. But she still wanted to become a rabbi. She began to do some preaching. The newspapers, the German newspapers, recognized that overnight we received the first Jewish female preacher in Germany. And she kept pursuing her dream. And in 1935, December of 1935, she went to Offenbach, Germany, where she met with a very well-known liberal rabbi named Max Dienemann. And he gave her the examination that Banach had not been able to give her, and he ordained her privately. So not from a seminary, but he gave her private ordination. And he wrote, this is from his letter about the ordination, "Since I have recognized that her heart is with God and Israel, and since she has passed the exam I gave her, I attest that she is capable of answering questions in Jewish law, and that she deserves to be appointed to the rabbinical office, and may God support her." Now, that language, deserves to be appointed to the rabbinical office, is a little bit of a qualification, because he said he wasn't speaking for the Liberal Rabbis Association. He had no authority to make anybody else see that she was actually a rabbi. And he actually cautioned her. He said, don't use the title rabbi until we can get other rabbis to agree that you should be able to use this title. So despite that, she was called Rabbiner Dr. Regina Jonas. I mean, that's how people came to know her. And she returned to Berlin, and she kept trying to get a position, an appointment, to work as a rabbi. Now, she was never appointed by the German Gemeinde, the Berlin Gemeinde, the German Association of Jews. She never got a position in the congregation. But by 1935, things had changed dramatically for Jews in Germany. And while there had not been a feminist push for women's ordination, there's nothing in German Jewish women's organizations about ordaining a woman until Jonas comes on the scene. Nobody's saying, let's have women rabbis, the way they were in America. There's no argument, there's no conversation about it. But by 1935, with the situation worsening in Germany, and German Jews desperately trying to get out, and rabbis often being able to be the ones who were able to flee because they had connections, Jonas actually found unusual opportunities to serve her community. So for example, she got appointments by the Gemeinde to work in homes for the aged. She preached, she lectured. Sometimes she actually officiated at services, so she replaced visiting rabbis. Sometimes that happened. She wrote a play for Hanukkah, and the children performed it. She especially worked with the elderly. And the situation in Germany for the elderly was really increasingly dire, because it was easier for people who were younger, sort of like the CET students' age. It's easier for people your age to get out, because first of all, your parents, if they were German, wanted to get you out. Secondly, you were young enough to start someplace else, and you weren't losing your business behind. And so there are lots of letters that have survived to Jonas in which children of aged parents wrote her and thanked her for bringing them clothes, or visiting their aged parents in the hospital, or bringing them gifts at Hanukkah. So we know that she was actively functioning at least some of the ways that rabbis function. And she also wrote why she wanted to be a rabbi. She said, what drove me as a woman to become a rabbi was her belief in this godly calling and her love for the Jewish people. And that she had to realize that these gifts that she had, she thought were God-given, that she had to become a rabbi. And she also understood that the Jews in Germany were living in a time of trial by fire. In March of 1941, there were 55,000 Jews still living in Berlin. And Jonas, like all of those 55,000 remaining Jews, was sentenced to slave labor. She ended up working in a war-related industry, a munition shop. She worked from 7 in the morning till 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And we know about her work because of documents survived where she wrote a petition saying, I cannot go to the grocery store in the hours that are open to the Jews because of my work. And so she needed special permission to shop at another point in time. But she feared, as did all of the remaining Berlin Jews, that the deportations that they were being called to. And her brother, she had a brother who was deported first to the Lodz ghetto in Poland, and he never returned. So he must have died in the Lodz ghetto, or he died in one of the killing centers. And she was taking care of her aged mother, which may be why she never tried to get out. She also had a friendship with a rabbi, or a kind of special friendship. Her biographer, Jonas's biographer, Lisa Klapek, thinks that they were lovers. And he we have nothing that shows that she tried to get out, but he actually wrote a letter to people that he knew asking, are they having women rabbis in America? Because if they are, then maybe she can get out and she can become a woman rabbi there. But obviously that never happened. And in November 1942, she was deported to what the Nazis called Theresienstadt and what you here today call Terezin. And she was deported with her mother to Terezin, the so-called model concentration camp. Now, have the students, have you been to Terezin already? Okay, so you know, anybody, has everybody been there? Has anybody not been there? Yep, you've all been there? Okay, so you know that what was unusual about Terezin was, first of all, that it was both a ghetto and a concentration camp, but mostly it was a transit station, a way station to Auschwitz. And you also know that it was a place where there was a celebration, this extraordinary celebration of intellectual life. We at American University, I don't know if you saw this, did you see Defiant Requiem last semester? Washington, D.C. based composer and professor of music, Murray Sidlin, has composed he interleaves in between Verdi's Requiem, which was performed 16 times in the camp. He interleaves the story of Raphael Schachter, who was the director of the chorus there. And I don't know, it has been performed in Prague. Have any of you seen it?
Terezin.
At Terezin, yes. It's really quite extraordinary. And it's a way of highlighting the intellectual work that was there. Well, Jonas was part of that. We have a document that survived from Terezin where she listed the titles of 24 lectures given by the one and only woman rabbi, Regina Jonas. So she was aware of her historical place, and she had delivered lectures in Berlin, and they must have been the same lectures that she gave here. She lectured on women in the Bible. She lectured on fundamentals of Judaism as seen through our holidays, characters in the first book of Moses, a conversation with God, women in the Talmud, religious customs of the Jews. So she was, Terezin, one book about Terezin calls it the University over the Abyss. And so there were over 2,500 lectures, over 500 lecturers. So she was part of that world, and that document lasted. And so we don't know, other than that, we know a little bit about her life in Terezin. She was assigned to the so-called Department of Personal Hygiene, which was headed by the distinguished psychologist Viktor Frankl, although Frankl, who wrote about Terezin and his experiences, never mentioned her, but he knew her because she worked there. And her job was to meet the deportees at the train station and take them to their barracks, because here you were bringing these persecuted German Jews coming from Germany, from Austria, and obviously also from Prague, and then taking them and cramming 24 of them into a single barracks in Terezin. And so she, as a pastor essentially, met them and tried to counsel them and tried to aid them. So we know that about her life there. And we also know that on the 12th of October 1944, she was deported from Terezin on one of the very last transports out of Terezin. And she and her mother were taken to Auschwitz, and we know she was murdered in Auschwitz. We assume that it was the day the transport arrived, which would have been 15th October. And that assumption is because she was over 40 at that point, and her mother was aged, and they would have been sent straight to the gas chambers. There's no trace of her after that. So when I was writing my book, I was really interested in her legacy. Because in the 1950s and the 1960s, as I was doing the research and I was reading, I would find people who had been Holocaust survivors in America and who had said that they met a woman rabbi in Terezin, and they would call her Rabbiner Dr. Jonas. And it was very unusual because in the 1950s and the 1960s, there's no trace of her story in America. And it's not until the early 1970s when a young American woman is once again trying to become a rabbi. Her name was Sally Priesand. And Sally Priesand does what all of these other women did in rabbinical school, and that is she goes to rabbinical school. She's in Cincinnati, it happens to be, and this is a very different moment in American life. It's the middle of the 1960s. She's starting the second wave of American feminism is on the rise. American colleges and universities are opening their doors, and elite schools that never let women in are letting women in. Women are entering law and medicine in really significant numbers. And Sally Priesand says, I'm going to be a rabbi. And she's not the only one. There are other women along the way as well. She goes to rabbinical school, and what does she have to do? She has to write a rabbinical thesis. And so she writes a rabbinical thesis, which is about the history of women in Reform Judaism. And when she writes that, she discovers that she is, and I will quote, that if she is ordained, this is what she's writing in her thesis, she will not truly be the first woman rabbi, because Sally Priesand had a professor who had survived and who knew Jonas and told her that Jonas had received this private ordination. So Sally Priesand says that I won't actually be the first, I'll actually be the second woman rabbi, but I will be the first to be ordained by a rabbinical seminary. And in 1972, in June 1972, Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati ordained Sally Priesand a rabbi. And so since then, hundreds of women have become rabbis. They had to fight in other movements, in the conservative movement in the United States. The battle begins, even before Sally Priesand's a rabbi, conservative Jewish women are saying, we want also to be rabbis, and they fight a very public battle that only lasts for about 12 years. In 1985, the first one is ordained. Orthodox Jewish women begin the same battle almost at the same moment in time. As they're watching what's going on, they say, can't we also become rabbis? And that battle is still being waged in the Orthodox movement, but there have been some Orthodox women who have been privately ordained, not ordained by a seminary, but they've received private ordination. And we begin to see female rabbis in England, in Germany. In 2010, I didn't make the papers here, Alina Traeger was ordained a rabbi, first woman ordained a rabbi in Germany. There have been female rabbis serving in Germany earlier. And also in Israel. So they were following in the footsteps of Rabbiner Dr. Regina Jonas and also of Sally Priesand. They were all women who wanted to be rabbis, and these women actually became them. So I'll be pleased to take questions or comments and remarks. So any thoughts? Yeah, I'm personally curious how you know about Jonas.
To me, she's quite well known, particularly because in the context of Theresienstadt, she's being referred to quite often. I was just trying to think about the strategy she was using to argue for women becoming rabbis by arguing there have been important Jewish women in the past, etc., etc. Is this similar to the way how non-Jewish women would argue at the same time?
Right. One of the things I did in the book, we're both historians, so you have to have wider context. So I was always looking at what the doctors were saying, the lawyers were saying, and the clergy, because I felt they were learned professions, they were exactly on par. And you see the same kind of thing. So the women who try to become physicians, first of all, they point to women's healing roles earlier. So they have that. And the women who become lawyers, they also say there's no kind of, nothing about the law that prohibits a woman from fulfilling that. And the closest example, of course, are the women who become clergy. And what they do is they have a tough job, because the women who become clergy have to deal with Paul, and Paul from the Gospels, and Paul's statement there about women having to be silent in church. And so they have a difficult time, but they look at the history of their particular church, because this is not Catholic, and they look at their churches and they say how women superseded that teaching.
If I can add one more question, it kind of struck me. It's actually a strategy that is very similar to the way how emancipation of Jews has been promoted from Jewish part by referring to the Jewish contribution to whatever industry, science, etc., etc. So basically, the emancipation of Jewish women is being argued for in the same manner.
Yeah, I mean, well, essentially, they're emancipation struggles. I mean, I would say in terms of American history, you would probably see, some of the same arguments made in terms of African American society as well. So that I think you're right. I think that there are certain parallels, and also these women, Jonas would have known about the Haskalah, about the Enlightenment. The others probably would not have. They weren't that well educated. Irma Levy-Lindheim was so unknowledgeable about Judaism that she invited some famous Zionists to her house, and she served him all sorts of forbidden foods, all sorts of trays, because she didn't know that, she had no idea. She was told that he eats fish, so she served him shellfish, But Jonas would have known. So I think, I think there are interesting, important parallels. I know people who have talked about the book have seen it as part and parcel of the theme of emancipation in the Jewish community. But it's also so integrated into the other pieces, the women's story, the wider context. Jacob?
I'm curious about Jonas within the Nazi German context, which was one, if I understand it correctly, of a hyper-masculine aesthetic. When the Nazi Party had a return of women to traditional roles, and sort of a turning back the clock on any sort of ideas of these liberal progressive movements. And at the same time, it created space for Rabbi Jonas because, you say, of the lack of rabbis leaving us. How did that function? And even in Theresienstadt, which was controlled, even with some sort of Jewish self-rule, it was really Nazi-controlled. In which case, how did those two trends interact with each other?
I have a couple of thoughts about it. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is that she's actually, in terms of the Jewish community, what they're letting her do, with a couple of exceptions, is write a play for children to perform, because there's no Jewish education going on. Go, take care of the elderly, help them. So those roles are rabbinical roles that are, in a sense, very much feminized. I mean, really, if you think about it in those terms. But she's anomalous. I mean, she's anomalous from the beginning. First of all, in her thesis, she says a woman who becomes a rabbi cannot marry. So she's already pulling herself outside of that community. She's saying you can't have conflicts between these two, kind of relationships between your husband and then between what you would owe to the community. So she says, but women should be able to be rabbis and make that choice. But that comes with the territory. So she's already violating German Jewish bourgeois norms about motherhood. Even in the 1920s, the German Jewish community is still a very traditional bourgeois community, and while there are women who rebel against that, and large numbers of Jewish women actually become doctors, but by and large, it's still very much the bourgeois ideal. But at Theresienstadt, I don't know how she functioned. I mean, she had to work. Everyone had to work. So she's assigned this job of greeting these people. How often did she actually lecture? I don't know. I mean, we have the list. We have how she identified herself, and we know from survivors' memories they saw her that way. But how widely she was perceived in that context as somebody so anomalous in terms of profession, I have no way of knowing.